Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Baron and this is your Brain on Books, and today I want to talk about a book that's incredibly special to me, and that is Clive Barker's Weaveworld. So, I'm a huge Clive Barker fan, and everything I've read from him so far, Weaveworld takes the cake. This is a phenomenal book. It was so ahead of its time. It came out in 1987 and really laid the framework for a lot of the urban portal dark fantasy epics that we know and love today. I mean, I'm talking about things like Dresden Files and The Dark Tower and Shades of Magic series and a lot of Neil Gaiman's work. All before then, there was Weaveworld doing that stuff, and not just doing those things, but doing them exceptionally well. So I just quickly want to talk about what is this book about? What makes it special, and should you pick it up? And I hope you do. I highly encourage any fantasy fan to jump into the vast imagination that is Clive Barker. So before we get into the story, let's talk about Clive Barker for a second. So he is an English-born playwright. He's an illustrator. He is a well-accomplished painter, a true man of the arts. And in the early 80s, he gave a crack at writing, and oh my gosh, did he do a phenomenal job. He wrote a ton of horror, kind of splatterpunk short stories and novellas, one of which was called Hellbound Heart. Now, he decided that he wanted to jump into the world of film, and he adopted the Hellbound Heart into the horror classic known as Hellraiser, which really put him on the map in the 80s with the, that big popularity of all the slasher films back then. And he adopted a bunch of his other works. There was The Nightbreed and Lord of Illusion, The Midnight Meat Train, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So in the horror world, Clive Barker's a huge, well-respected name. So much so that, Stephen King himself said, "I've seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker." Well, Clive had a different plan. In the mid-'80s, he decided he was going to step away from horror, and he wanted to focus once again on the imagination. And there's no better place for an author to really express their imagination than fantasy. And his first big foray into the genre was none other than Weaveworld. And good grief, did he not do a fantastic job with this? I mean, this has gained a pretty significant cult following, but in the larger fantasy ethos, and when people are talking, greatest of all time lists and stuff, this is not on there. And it's a bit of a shame. I think this is a truly remarkable work in the genre. However, it is very different. It really blends a lot of different things. It's got science fiction. It's got horror. It's got magical realism. It has erotica in it. It's literally just a smorgasbord of everything. And it's really, the whole point is to be a visual transposition of the imagination, kind of transposed into the written word. So what is it about? You're following two main protagonists, and it's their descent into Wonderland. That's a kind of a theme in a story narrative format that we're all familiar with. And they're going into the world of a magic carpet. Now, we're not talking about Aladdin here. We're talking about an entire world that exists in a carpet called the Fugue. I don't know if you can see that there. Pretty good. Might be a glare. Got covers on these books, but man, isn't that cool? I love this cover. Isn't that cool? So anyway, the Fugue. Now, this world was created by a bunch of people that lived in our society at the time that were persecuted because they had supernatural abilities. Now, you can almost think like Salem witch trials, and that's going to give you kind of a rough idea of what we're working with here. So they took bits and pieces of our world, the ones that they loved and appreciated, and kind of made this amalgamation of a world woven into this carpet so they could live in and hide away from society until they felt that society was, advanced enough and accepting enough to where they could reemerge and have their own place without persecution. And there's some guardians in our actual world to kind of oversee this actual carpet. So at its essence, that's a very simple story, right? And the Wonderland concept of kind of being thrown into this other world is something that we're very familiar with. We've seen done before. So what does he do differently here? Well, as you might assume, when you're having this separation of these two worlds, you see these characters from ours go into there, and then also you have this world spill out into ours, which gives him the opportunity to explore some really heavy themes, not about persecution, about greed, about power, about extensive wealth. And you just see these big clashes between the two worlds happen. But not only you see a clash, but you also see a tremendous amount of beauty and juxtaposition that he just does so well. And the way that the narrative is formatted has a lot of mythological tropes that we associate with fantasy and subverts them like extremely. And in the mid 80s, that was not a thing. I mean, you got to think what was out at the time. We're talking like Shannara and, Dragonlance Chronicles. And like that was what was popular in fantasy, this Tolkien derivative sword and sorcery fantasy. I mean, having portal jumping, like going different worlds with crazy creatures and, just like weird sex, and it didn't exist. There might be other examples that I'm just not aware of. And if there are, please mention them below. I'd love to check it out. But the closest thing that I can think of to this would be the Dark Tower series. And that's how I first came across this. It's like, I'm a big Dark Tower fan, so I was like, okay, what else is out there that's really going to scratch that itch, that's going to have that similar flavor? And I kept seeing this come up, Weaveworld. So I gave it a try, and not only is it kind of similar in flavor, this did it first. The second Dark Tower book, The Drawing of the Three, is kind of a similar portal jumping, kind of genre blending fantasy epic. And it came out after this. So once again, Barker just way ahead of its time. And there is a big comparison between Clive Barker and Stephen King, which it's hard to not do because, you're going to compare every horror author to Stephen King. But I think their writing styles are just so vastly different. King's a very character-focused writer. And Barker is not at all. I'm not saying his character work is bad, but his characters are what you expect them to be and nothing more. However, he has this like beautiful lyrical prose that you just don't see in King's work. And that's fine, that's not King's thing. That's not why you read his books. But Barker just, oh my gosh, the way that he can take the visual experience that he puts into his films and his illustrations and his paintings, and he can transpose that into a novel, to the written word. I just don't know anyone else that quite does it like that. And also the way that he formats his narrative structure, coming from a place of a screenwrite and a playwright, is that, it reads like a film. And it's not like that back and forth dialogue like I've seen other books try to do to recreate the kind of that cinematic feeling. He does it so more of like trying to create, like you're the reader and you're just watching this visual spread. And I'm really having a hard time articulating this because it's just so unique. I don't know any other author that quite does it the same way that he does. And you have to just experience it to know what I'm talking about and to really see the beauty behind it. After Weaveworld, he continued with this kind of trend of fantasy epics. He has another one that's even more, I would say, ambitious, called the Magica, and then he has the Book of the Art, and he really continued with this theme. And I think he kind of shot himself in the foot because he kind of got this huge following as this horror guy, and that was his fan base. And then he just kind of ditched it and went this different direction that was no longer accepted by his horror fan base, but yet he was so vastly different ahead of the time in the fantasy world that most fantasy readers at the time weren't getting his stuff either. And he just developed this really narrow cult following, and here we are decades later, and it's kind of fallen off the face of the planet, and nobody's talking about this guy when he is probably one of the best fantasy prose writers, period, bar none. I will never change my mind on that. He's just phenomenal. So that's enough gushing for now. I encourage you to pick this up. It is a big book. If you want something maybe a little smaller taste of what he's into, you can try The Hellbound Heart I mentioned earlier. It's a really quick novella. You'll get a sense of his writing style, see if it's a good fit for you. If you're looking for your next big epic fantasy book, please pick this up. Let me know what you think about it. If you've read it already, leave your thoughts down below. I'd love to talk to more people about this book because I feel like I'm all alone over here just just going through Clive Barker's catalog, and everyone else is just clueless. Not everyone, but it's just criminally underrepresented is what I'm trying to say. So anyway, if you made it to the end of this, thanks for hanging out with me and letting me gush about one of my favorite authors. Until next time, see ya.